Our next speaker is Dr. David Halaas. He's a consultant to the Northern Cheyenne Tribe. He's also the former state historian for the state of Colorado. His talk is entitled Written in Blood, the Soul Kramer Massacre Letters. Dr. Halaas.
Thank you, Karen. When the soldiers returned to Denver in mid-December 1864, they entered the city led by a brass band consisting of members of the 1st Regiment. The troops filed through the streets. The line went on for over a mile. Sidewalks were crowded with cheering Denverites, hailing the returning soldier boys, the bold soldier boys in blue. The Indian problem had been solved. A great celebration. There was for 3 nights actually, a presentation in the Denver Theater showing the trophies of Sand Creek. Everybody was content, but almost before the trumpet stopped blaring, a little item in the Rocky Mountain News announced that certain high officials were circulating letters saying that Sand Creek was not a battle, but a massacre of women and children and the elderly. Just a little small article in the personal section, which is just, brief paragraphs put together. But the next day, another article appeared in the Rocky Mountain News. And this time it was written by editor William Newton Byers. And he said, this must have been written by, these letters must have been written by Easterners who have no idea of what we face here out in the West. And those opening articles were followed by more and more. People are starting to take notice. These letters very quickly led into congressional investigations into Sand Creek. The powerful Joint Committee on the Conduct of the Civil War took up the issue. Another Joint Committee on the Conduct of the Indian Tribes took up the issue. And then the Army itself, because remember that the troops at Sand Creek were not militia. They were U.S. volunteer troops under the chain of command of the War Department and the Army. The Army held months of investigations, taking testimony. And all 3 committees and the hearing determined that Sand Creek was not a battle, but a massacre of peaceful Indians who are under the protection of the U.S. flag. Those investigations were followed by the Treaty of the Little Arkansas in 1865. The treaty, by Article 6, the United States government admitted guilt for Sand Creek, responsibility, admitted that it was a peaceful encampment under the protection of the United States flag. And by Article 6, the treaty promised reparations to the families of survivors. Even stipulated how much the chiefs were to receive in land. They would also pay for property lost. It's the only treaty I know signed by the U.S. government that admitted guilt for anything. So the United States admitted responsibility for Sand Creek from the very beginning. Those investigations were launched because of 2 letters. Now, in the process of creating the park, the National Historic Site, Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell had introduced a bill to create the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. And 2 weeks before testimony was to be given in front of a committee of the U.S. Senate, a woman came to my office, a woman from Evergreen, who brought a big packet of material that she found in a trunk. And she said that her great-grandfather had arrived in Colorado in 1859 and had a ranch down by Fort Lyon. And she wanted me to look at this material to see if it was worth any money. And she told me it was about the Sand Creek Massacre. So I began going through these documents, and many of them were testimony of the written testimony of the Army hearings. And they weren't anything that we hadn't seen before. So after some time, she kind of looked sad that I said that I didn't think there was anything worth here, but as a state employee, I couldn't tell her what they were worth anyway. She had to go someplace else. But there was one little packet, like a stationery box, that she didn't show me. And I asked, what's in that box? And she said, oh, nothing, just some typewritten letters. And the typewriter wasn't invented in 1864. But I asked her, she'd show them to me, and I opened the box. And I saw these typewritten letters. And I noticed the name of Silas Soule and another name, Joseph Kramer. And the hair on the back of my neck went up. And I asked her to leave my office, and I called Dr. Gary Roberts. And I said, Gary, I want you to listen to this. And Gary said, you know what you got there, don't you? You got the letters of Silas Soule and Joseph Kramer. Letters that had never been read before, but the letters that had led into the investigations of Sand Creek. So I made copies of those letters, and then I began to read them in full. And they are very, very disturbing. They were written by Captain Silas Soule of the 1st Colorado Regiment, and by Joseph Kramer, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, also of the 1st Colorado Regiment. They were at Sand Creek. And they were two company commanders that refused to fire at Sand Creek. Not only did they refuse to fire, but their companies refused to fire. Perhaps over 100 men. And after the massacre, these men were angry, disturbed, and they wanted to do something about it. So they wrote letters to their former commander, Major Edward Wincoop. And they wrote the letters in hopes that Wincoop would understand what happened there and would go to Washington and circulate the letters. So they made copies of their letters. What was in that box was a manuscript copy. And this is a hard thing, but I'm going to read passages from those letters that describe the massacre and what they saw. Silas Soule wrote his letter from Fort Lyon on December 14, 1864. And he describes to Ned, Wincoop was known as Ned, the circumstances of Chivington coming to Fort Lyon, his meeting with the officers officers of the 1st Regiment, who protested against any engagement with Black Kettle and Left Hand's band. And then he said, I refused to fire and swore that none but a coward would. For by this time, hundreds of women and children were coming towards us and getting on their knees for mercy. Major Anthony shouted, "Kill the sons of bitches." The massacre lasted 6 or 8 hours. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One woman was wounded, and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her. She held her arms up to defend her, and he cut off one arm and held the other with one hand and dashed the hatchet through her brain. One woman with her 2 children were on their knees begging for their lives, a dozen soldiers within 10 feet of them all firing. When one succeeded in hitting the woman in the thigh, when she took a knife out and cut the throats of both children and then killed herself. I saw 2 women take hold of one another's hands, chased until they were exhausted, when they kneeled down and clasped each other around the neck and were both shot together. Lieutenant Kramer wrote his letter 4 days later on December 19. And he said, "This is the first opportunity I have of writing you since the great Indian massacre. And for a start, I will acknowledge I am ashamed to own I was in it with my company. Well, I got so mad, I swore I would not burn powder, and I did not. Captain Soule the same. After the fight, there was a sight I hope I may never see again. Men, women, and children were scalped. Fingers cut off to get the rings on them. A woman ripped open and a child taken from her. Little children shot while begging for their lives. Women shot while on their knees and with their arms around soldiers begging for their lives. Kramer then went on to say, Colonel Shivington was going to have Soule hung for saying they were all cowardly sons of bitches. I told the colonel that I thought it murder to jump them friendly Indians. He says in reply, damn any man or men who are in sympathy with Indians. And then he said to Wynkoop, if you are in Washington, for God's sake, Major, keep Shivington from being a brigadier general, which he expects. There are many other passages to read, but when I read those, well, we contacted Senator Campbell. And at the hearing, Senator Campbell read those letters and entered them into the congressional record. Never was there such a moving hearing. In the attending the hearing, because he had another hearing, was Senator John Warner of Virginia. And he asked permission to stand up and say something. And he said, after hearing Senator Campbell read the letters, that he had never heard such disturbing testimony in his tenure in the U.S. Senate, and promised to do everything he could to help Senator Campbell get this bill passed and get the National Historic Site created. And in about 4 weeks, that bill finally passed. William Faulkner once said, the past isn't dead. It's not even past. So here are letters that launched the initial investigations into Sand Creek. And then 135 years later, year 2000, were finally seen and discovered. Two soldiers who witnessed atrocities that they hoped they would never see again. Both these men testified in those investigations. In fact, at the Army hearings, Captain Soule was the first to testify. Went on for days. And we have verbatim reproductions of those testimonies. And then Kramer followed him, saying what they said in their letters. Two brave men who disobeyed orders from their commander. Shortly after his testimony, Captain Soule was in Denver, acting as provost marshal for the city. And one night, he heard a shot, and he ran to investigate. Two men clad in blue jumped out and shot him. Killed on the streets of Denver at 15th and Arapahoe. Whether they were there at Shivington's orders, no one knows. But Silas Soule had told people that he expected to be killed because of his testimony. And attempts were made on his life. And he knew that describing what he saw was a very dangerous thing. And so today at the healing runs, which have been going on since 1999, on the last day of the run, the Cheyenne and Arapahoes meet at Riverside Cemetery, where Captain Soule is buried. And they run from there to 15th and Arapahoe, where he was assassinated. And through their efforts, working with History Colorado, a plaque was put up designating the site. Because they believe these two brave men saved hundreds of lives, that without their commitment to justice and right, many of the descendants today would not be here. And that's why they honor him in the way that they do. It should be noted also that the murderers, and there were two of them, were known, but they were never brought to justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Halaas.